All right. Welcome, Patty. I would like to introduce you to the audience of native plant enthusiasts that we are hosting this month with our social media campaign for all things native plants. If you would, please just introduce yourself and your organization and your work with native plants.
Thanks, Claire. I'm Patti Ragsdale. I'm the grower and owner of a very small native plant nursery out in Tonganoxie called Happy Apples Farm. We do not grow apples, just native plants. And pretty soon we'll be doing a nonprofit called Botanical Belonging. So I'm just going to show that real quick, just so everybody has that name out there to look for early next year. So my purpose out here is to really give people access to a wide variety of species that they can try in their garden.
So I've got a couple questions for you specifically around selecting native plants. You grow a lot of plants. You have a lot of knowledge about many of these native species that we can grow and work with a lot of gardeners in terms of making these choices. So just to get a picture of your frame of reference around some of this decision-making process when you're selecting plants for a native landscape. So what are questions that you do ask yourself when selecting native plants for a landscape?
Well, I think the first question for me is, what habitat are these plants going into? And the second question would be, where do these plants come from? Because that really matches those two things up. And so this image right here is from the Kanza Prairie Nature Trail, and it's the very edge of the trail, which was just abundant with blooms before most of the rest of the prairie was blooming. So I find a lot of inspiration in these kinds of settings. And this is just a really small little vignette in a big expanse of grass. So you can see that. And it really kind of speaks to the need for that matrix of a lot of different diverse plants. But those are the questions I ask myself when I'm thinking about how to work these plants into the landscape. So in this picture, this is a walk last fall with the Kansas Native Plant Society down in Southeast Kansas. And this again was the edge of a mowed trail, and bison graze this pasture, but it's full of, you kind of get a sense here that there's a lot of different plants in here, and one of them is blackberry. So it's got blackberry in it and everything. And then this pink flower, which was the standout at this time of year in September, that one's Agellinus, I think it's Agellinus. I'm not real sure which one it was. I think it's rough Agellinus, but it's I think an annual plant that we saw a lot of in the fall here in this prairie. And it was my first exposure to the first time I'd gotten to meet this beautiful being that happens every year in these prairies. So anyway, there's a lot to learn by walking in these preserved environments that really are disappearing. So I think gardeners, landscapers have a real big opportunity to help maintain habitat for these plants that I hope will be here for many, many years because of us, instead of disappearing because of us.
And the thought of just going out and walking in native ecosystems, I think not only will you get a lot of your questions answered about what you're looking for, but it will also open up the door to a lot more questions that you'll have the opportunity to pursue and get more involved.
Yeah, and I think, seeing them in these habitats is interesting because they, a lot of times you really have to be moving slowly and looking for them to see them. But then when we take them out and we put them in a garden space, we give them a lot more freedom. So sometimes they behave a little differently, but sometimes that's a really good thing. You get a lot more from that plant, depending on, where we're putting them. They teach me so much more about plants than I can really share just by watching them over several years. And I'll just give a shout out to Scott Woodbury at the Whitmire Wildflower Garden at the Shaw Nature Reserve. He has started a native plant trial garden there where it's 5 years in the making already. And so he just did his first kind of share out, I think, last winter, which was, just awesome to have someone in an environment with a lot of helpers and things to examine these native plants over 5 years, because that's something to think about, because they do have a lifespan. They do behave differently in gardens, things like that. But it's all of us learning together and really enjoying that whole process of incorporating these beautiful plants into our landscapes.
All right, so next question. What are different kinds of native plants that grow and work with, that you grow and work with, and what do they contribute to their space?
Well, it depends, on the space, right? Some plants, like in this photo, is of a dry creek bed that we have kind of going through our front yard, and the edges of it can be really dry or really wet, depending on the time of year. And part of this is constantly irrigated by us. Basically, we have a kind of a gray water system that waters part of this. And at this year that this photo was taken, there's some cardinal flower in there. It's no longer there. So if you try to grow cardinal flower, you might find out that it is not a very long-lived plant, and it really depends on a very specific kind of environment. It'll come back from seed, but the seeds really do need a very specific environment to actually grow. So this area right here, for me, I really want impact throughout the whole year, but the irises that are kind of in the front of the lower part of that photo, those bloom really early in the spring. So they're actually back behind the little tree and the pot. The irises are right in there. Yeah. So those guys, they bloom in May, and then they're done. So I needed something throughout the season. And this is later in the season when the cardinal flower is blooming. And that's sometime in August, sometimes later than that, even September. So using the seed heads from some things to give some interest, but mixing that up so I have interest throughout the season is really an important aspect of using these in a landscape. One, the habitat, but the second is, when are they going to provide me interest, and how long through the season? What's that interest look like? So some things might be black seed heads, some things might be color, and all the time, those are providing habitat for the pollinators, the insects that we're all kind of wanting to support with these native landscapes. Yeah, look at that. That was our most recent big job, was winterizing the leftover retail. So this is what's left over from our season. I think we had close to 200 species that we offered up last season. They weren't huge numbers of those, but if somebody was looking for that particular plant, right, they could maybe come and kind of try it out, like me. A lot of times, some of the plants in these mixes are new to me, so I don't know that much. I might have just gotten seeds from somebody and I want to try them. Courtney Masterson at Native Lands LLC will sometimes just give me something and say, here, try this. And or I'll find something in my pasture and I'll ask somebody at the herbarium, or Courtney, or somebody who walks pastures a lot, what is this? And that's how I come across some of these. And one of them I'll just mention that I don't have a photo of, and I should have included it, is bushy seed box. It's Ludwigia alternifolia. It's an interesting plant because it turns red, bright red in the fall, and produces tons of seeds. But the neat thing is, all winter it has these really beautiful bead-like seed heads. So, I mean, again, this kind of variety in a retail space, especially as small as the one I have, I don't offer big numbers for big restorations and things like that, but it's more about giving all of us access to learning about these species. And for me, the first thing I'm going to do is research. I'm going to learn as much as I can from the internet, Google searches, the herbarium over at KU, Mobot, the Missouri Botanical Garden website is a great resource for a lot of native plants. And interestingly, this is a trick I tell people, because nobody I know is a real expert at Latin names, but we all do our best and we teach each other. But the Missouri Botanical Garden site in their plant finder, up next to the Latin name up there, there'll be a little speaker. And if you press that and wait, somebody will say that Latin name. Whether they say it right or not, I don't know, but it gives me a hint into how to say these names. And Latin names are quite important in distinguishing, because if somebody asks me for a coneflower, oh my goodness, there's a lot of plants that coneflower refers to. But if they ask me for Echinacea purpurea, I know exactly which one they want. So those kinds of things are start to get more important as you talk about native plants, because they all have common names that can be different, but their Latin name rarely changes. I'm not going to say it never does, because there are some wonderful resources out there though for learning about that.
That's very helpful tip. Thank you, Patty. Okay, so what have been some standout native plants that you enjoy growing in a landscape?
Well, this little space that this picture is next to the walkway in front of my house, and it changes all through the season. But one thing that stands out in this space all the time is prairie dock. It is and that's the large leaves back there that you see. That thing, there's nothing that looks like that has that much impact. Really throughout the season. Now there are some, the silphiums, it's Silphium terebinthinacum. So it's a long word. That's the Latin name for that plant. But all those silphiums are big kind of plants. There's cup plant, compass plant, prairie dock, and prairie rosinweed. Those are all silphiums that are from this area. Now, prairie dock is more of a Missouri plant than a Kansas plant. But it really is in a garden very beautiful. The caution with these giant plants is seeds. We don't want to let those go to seed in your garden, because they grow really, really well from seed. And you might end up with a forest of giant plants. And so having this plant in the garden, I just would not want to never have this plant in a garden, because it is so beautiful, just the leaves. And then what you don't see in this picture is some tall, naked stalks that come out of that rosette of leaves, which that rosette of leaves can be like 4 feet around. It's a big, big plant. But the stalks that come out of that can be 7 feet tall, and they're naked. So they have it's just a real tall stalk. And then at the top, there's a big inflorescence of like sunflowers. They look like sunflowers. They're beautiful pollinator plants. But again, when I'm working with silphiums, and there's another silphium in there, I really want to control its self-seeding in my garden. Other plants that are in this space that really stand out at different times of the year are the Baptisia. So those inflated kind of pale green seed pods there, those things, oh my goodness, it takes them a while to get established. So this one's probably 4 or 5 years old, doing really well. And it will last a very long time, as will that silphium in this garden space. So some of the other things around it are really just fillers, and they kind of come in at different times of the year. So the purple plant at the bottom, that one is, it has a lot of different common names, but it's Ruellia humilis, or I think it's called wild petunia is what I call it, but it's called fringed Ruellia, or I don't know. It's pretty hairy looking. It does throw its seeds everywhere, but it doesn't come out until later in the season. So earlier in the season, you don't see it at all. There's nothing there. And I think there's some other plants in there, like blue-eyed grass, Cicerin. Well, I don't even know how to say that Latin name. So those 3 plants that I've just mentioned in there are really a nice combination for this area and stand out. The grasses that you see in here, and grasses are really important, and I rely on them more and more the older that these gardens get, to provide kind of an understory. But the one that's just kind of on the very left edge of the photo is prairie dropseed. That is a beautiful garden grass. I would put that one in any garden. It does take a long time to grow from seed. So for me, it's about a 2-year process to get a big enough plant that somebody might want to put in their garden. It stayed around. This one was planted in 2015. So it has not kind of come and go in the garden. It stayed right there. I do work in the spring to keep it cleaned out, because I don't burn this area or anything. So thatch is a real important thing to kind of remove from these really dense clumps of grass. But yeah, so that one is a real, I would not hesitate to suggest that plant for gardens. There are lots of grasses though. I mean, we could talk grasses and sedges forever.
I
And the
hope to get,
difference.
yeah, I hope to get some information out specifically on grasses, because that's something that I've learned working with rain gardens, is the value of these grasses in these gardens.
Yeah. So a lot of our native grasses are warm season, whereas opposed to the sedges, which are mostly cool season. So the sedges become a real useful tool early in this season.
Yeah.
So in this, this is a spring kind of vignette in really close to the front of my house. They're much shorter plants than the ones in the previous photo, but some things that are going to stand out in this photo and I find to be very helpful plants in gardens are the prairie alum roots. So those tall kind of yellowish flowers right there. They're not really that tall. They're, you know, maybe 3 feet when they are flowering, but that basal rosette of kind of coral bells looking leaves, and they are in the same genus as coral bells, the typical garden plant. But this one takes a lot more sun than we would typically put those other heucheras into. And it's a really long-lived plant. It's pretty much evergreen. So you plant that, and these leaves will kind of fade midsummer, but then it'll grow a new rosette of leaves that lasts through the winter. So right now I could go out and take a picture and you would see greenish kind of burgundy leaves still standing in this plant. So it is great. And then next to it, you can see some purple, really deep purple flowers there. That one is Cobea beard tongue or purple beard tongue, goes by a lot of different names. That plant actually isn't always that purple. So my understanding is the farther east that the genetics come from the more purple it is. Whereas if you get out into the Flint Hills in Kansas, it's almost white. But they are the same species. I got some purple ones and I'm real happy because I like it with the heuchera flower heads. So just creating these, this is a spring vignette, right? If we walk through this area, this is going to be, if I take a picture of the front of my house, this is where I want to be standing in spring to take a picture. But I kind of, when I landscape my gardens, do my garden spaces, I really think about, what do I see? Where are my views of these vignettes? And I try to design from that kind of viewpoint. And another one that really stands out in this photo is the prairie smoke, which I found a really interesting plant. It kind of finds its own space in this garden. It isn't really native to our area. It's a little bit north of us. So we're a little hot for it, even though it does like open spaces in these gardens. It tends to move back into, as it gets older, move itself back into the understory. But beautiful addition to the garden, does this beautiful smoke thing in the spring and early spring, like late February, early March. These are actually the seed heads that you're seeing. So it's already had a flower that's been pollinated, and the flower is a pink ball that it hangs down. And once like a queen bumblebee might pollinate that, she'll get there and do her buzz pollination thing, and that turns up. And that's where these seed heads form, at that turned up stage, and they flow out like that. That's the tail of the seed. So it's a beautiful plant, very interesting, and really provides some early season pollen resources and nectar resources for some of our bumblebee species that are out early. Let's see, anything else in this photo? There's a great big plant in this photo that might be hard to pick out, but it's a great garden plant too. It's called Amsonia illustris, or there's another one that's really close and I can't say the last name, but it's like Tabernae montana or something. But Amsonias are beautiful garden plants. They're very shrub-like in form. They bloom early in the season, beautiful kind of silvery blue blooms, but they die all the way back to the ground in the winter. And so they're herbaceous. They're not a shrub, but they're shrub-sized, shrub-shaped, and they keep that shape really well. So yeah, that one I would say is a really good one. Again, like the silphiums though, I don't let that one go to seed in my garden because tends to produce very easily from seed and lives a long, long time. Once you get one established and get it to that size, you have a standout kind of anchor for a garden that can act as a shrub very, very easily. It's never going to get tall, but it's going to be about maybe 3.5, 4 feet at this is a giant one. So it gets big. I don't want to kind of minimize that, but I would say most of them are under that at about that 3 foot or 2.5, 3 foot range. Thinking of that winter interest too, I mean, like the heuchera in here, that is a really important aspect of, what's going to happen in this space in winter, because that Amsonia will be gone. It'll have some stems left. And I generally, just because they're really big and heavy, I cut those back so I don't have so much falling out into my garden, because it is a big plant. But the heuchera, that alum root is, it is just always that nice edge for the garden. I use wild strawberry, Fragaria virginiana, not the kind that grows in your lawn, but this one actually came from our prairie here. Fragaria virginiana is a nice kind of evergreen ground cover. It's beautiful. It produces all kinds of color in the fall, and just a really wonderful thing to include in a garden as a ground cover. But just like most ground covers, it's quite aggressive. So a lot of people are, they hear that word and they don't want something. Yes, it will kind of go out into your lawn. And so what we do here is we just use a shovel to cut an edge on our garden. We don't have an edging on this particular garden, but we let that strawberry kind of make that flat space and help us with the weeds on those low spaces.
Okay. Final question for you, Patti. What resources have you found most valuable as you've expanded your knowledge of our region's native plants?
Well, I'd say that the thing that's taught me the most is being part of the Kansas Native Plant Society and attending the annual Wildflower Weekend. We call it the AW for short. If you want to walk with people and have them tell you every single little plant you see, you couldn't find a better way to do it, right? It's really fun. We walk very slow though, so it's not a real, hiking thing. It's more just walk real slow and look at plants, but a lot of fun. So the Kansas Native Plant Society, you can go to public gardens like the Pollinator Prairie, which that's a little, it's open all the time. So you can go there right now. There's not much going on. I volunteer my time there with the Extension Master Naturalist out of Johnson County. So we maintain that garden. Right now, of course, there's being winter, there's not much in there, but we do leave stems standing so you can kind of see some seed heads. We do a lot of our maintenance is managing the seeds, keeping them from self-seeding into the human spaces, which would be the paths that go through there. So, but it's a wonderful habitat garden, has a lot of different plants in it that kind of mimic that really highly diverse natural space, but it's beautiful throughout the seasons. And you'd really, with the exception of maybe winter, could go there anytime and see just a huge variety of native plants. So that's a really good thing. But as far as learning, kind of in-depth learning about plants, Missouri Botanical Garden is really useful. I find the Illinois Wildflower, I think .org. So online resources, my best way to research plants is really to find out what the Latin name is. Type that into Google and see what comes up. But I find the Illinois Wildflowers is really useful. Missouri Plants, I think, is a good one. Prairie Moon Nursery is a nursery that's online. They have a lot of good resources there, both for plant propagation and just about different plants. They might have slightly different species, like same genus, but different species. Mm-hmm. So watching that kind of thing, you start to learn those those things, but as you research these plants. But one thing I want to make sure I get out there is a range map. Looking at a range map is a real important way to understand what is native or not. So the prairie smoke we talked about. So if I look at a range map of prairie smoke, I learned that it doesn't really occur in Kansas. It doesn't really occur, you know what I mean? But it is a prairie plant, and it's beautiful in a garden. So kind of understanding the range really affects that. And the best place, the easiest place that I found to look at range maps is called BONAP. I think it's Biota of North America project or something like that, but it's BONAP.org. And I use those range maps a lot. And then iNaturalist, I use iNaturalist. If I'm just totally don't know a plant at all, I might look at that and see what they suggest as the possibility, because they're not going to really give me a lot of times a definitive ID. They're going to give me suggestions. And then it's up to me to look at those range maps and go do some research on the suggestions they've given me. And sometimes they haven't given me the right suggestion at all. So I use iNaturalist sometimes to give me a hint if I'm not familiar at all with a plant. So those are some of my most valuable resources.
That's funny you say that. Yesterday we used iNaturalist, and I do really enjoy using that app to give me a hint, as you suggested. But yesterday we were looking at a seed pod, and I knew it would have trouble identifying it, but it told us it was a green urchin, sea urchin. Okay.
Yeah,
All
you
right.
can use it for bugs too.
Yeah, it's great, and birds. So it's fantastic.
Yeah, it's a great resource. But I just always want to make sure that people, when they use it, understand the limitations. You know, it really depends on the time of year you take a photo, or the quality of your photo, whether you give them I mean, it's amazing how it can take my photo and tell me what I might be looking at. To me, I find that quite interesting, and it's a good resource for looking at photos of plants too. So if you wanted to search, you know, do some research on a certain species, you might find a lot of photos there. Hopefully people have done their research and not, you know, posted up there something that isn't that, but I think they review the IDs that go up there. They have some experts that are out there looking at those once you post them.
Well, Patti, thank you so much for your time this morning. It's been a real pleasure talking with you. I encourage everybody to not only check out the resources that Patti has suggested, but to, you know, think about what plants they're going to be planting next spring, and use Patti as a resource as you guys expand your native plant gardens.
So we'd love to see you.
Thank you so much, Patti. Have a great rest of your day.